Imagine being thrown out like trash after years of loyalty. No warning, no explanation, just, you're done. That's what happened to me. But here's the question. What would you do if the man who ruined your life handed you the chance to ruin his? Because when that day came, I didn't hesitate. The hum of fluorescent lights was the soundtrack of Daniel's life. Most nights, he was the last one in the office, staring at spreadsheets until his eyes blurred, the taste of stale coffee turning metallic on his tongue. For 8 years, this company had been more than a job. It was his identity, his anchor, his proof that hard work could carve meaning out of the chaos of the world. He wasn't the type who dreamed of yachts or golf courses. Daniel was the quiet engine behind success. If the servers went down at 2 a.m., he was the one driving through empty streets to reboot them. If a client threatened to walk, he was the one writing a desperate proposal at midnight, saving million-dollar contracts while his boss, Richard, slept soundly in some luxury condo overlooking the city skyline. Richard, his boss, his mentor, or at least what Daniel told himself in the early years, was the type of man who thrived on appearances. Impeccable suits, Rolex watches that flashed beneath expensive cufflinks, stories of closing deals over rounds of golf. He wasn't cruel, not openly. He had the kind of smile that made you feel chosen, like your loyalty was noticed. But behind closed doors, Daniel knew. Richard's empire wasn't built on strategy or innovation. It was built on people like him, burning themselves alive just to keep the lights on. Still, Daniel believed. That was the tragedy of it. He believed loyalty mattered. He believed sacrifice was an investment that would pay off one day. Promotions passed him by, but Richard always had a word ready. Your time is coming, Daniel. Trust me. You're the backbone of this place. And Daniel swallowed those words like scripture, convincing himself that patience was strength. His friends didn't understand. Over beers, they teased him. Man, you're basically running the place. Why not start your own thing? Daniel would shrug, hiding the exhaustion in his voice. It's not that simple. Richard gave me my shot when no one else would. I owe him. What he didn't say was that he feared leaving. The company had consumed so much of him that the thought of stepping outside felt like erasing his own existence. Without it, who was he? There were signs, small cracks that hindsight would turn into flashing alarms. Richard taking credit for Daniel's work during board meetings. Richard promising bonuses that never arrived. The way his thank yous began to feel more like condescension than gratitude. But Daniel ignored them. He told himself trust meant weathering imperfections. He told himself family wasn't perfect either. And in a way, this company was the only family he had. At home, his apartment was a graveyard of neglect. Unopened mail stacked on the kitchen counter. Dishes left in the sink for weeks. A framed photo of an ex-girlfriend tucked face down in a drawer, a reminder of what his devotion had cost him. She had begged him to slow down, to build a life beyond the office. One day you're going to realize you gave everything to a man who wouldn't blink before replacing you, she'd said before leaving. Daniel had laughed it off then. Now those words would echo like prophecy. The people at the office respected him, though respect was a quiet thing. They came to him with problems, not Richard. When payroll was late, Daniel found a way to fix it. When tempers flared between departments, he smoothed them over. He was the mediator, the problem solver, the invisible glue holding everything together. Yet, when awards were handed out, it was Richard who stood beneath the spotlight, clinking champagne glasses while Daniel clapped from the shadows. And still, he stayed. Because deep down, Daniel clung to a fragile hope, that loyalty was not a wasted currency, that one day Richard would look him in the eye and say, "You're more than an employee, you're a partner." But that moment never came. Instead, what Daniel couldn't see, what he refused to see, was that Richard's empire was already beginning to crack. Clients whispered about broken promises, talented employees slipped away to competitors, investors grew restless. And while Daniel was too buried in his work to notice, Richard had already begun sharpening the knife he would one day use. For now, though, Daniel's world was simple in its illusion. A man, a desk, a stack of endless reports, and the unshakable belief that loyalty was its own kind of armor. The foundation was set. Strong, but fatally flawed. Because trust, once broken, doesn't shatter quietly. It explodes. Monday mornings had always carried their own kind of weight, But this one felt different before Daniel even stepped through the glass doors. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, sharp enough to sting his nose. The receptionist avoided his eyes. He told himself she was just busy. The hum of the elevator seemed louder than usual, a metallic groan that pressed against his chest as it carried him upward. When the doors slid open, he caught the flicker of glances from colleagues. The kind of glances people share when they know something you don't. Conversations cut short as he passed. Laughter swallowed mid-breath. A tension curled in his stomach. He brushed it off. Maybe Richard had pulled some ridiculous stunt over the weekend. Maybe there was a client disaster waiting upstairs. Nothing Daniel hadn't solved before. He walked toward Richard's office, the carpet muffling his footsteps, the weight of his laptop bag digging into his shoulder. The blinds were half closed, casting slanted shadows across the hallway. Richard's door stood slightly open, a rare thing, since Richard liked to control the image of privacy and power. Daniel knocked gently and stepped inside. Richard didn't look up. He was flipping through a set of glossy reports, his gold watch catching the light. For a moment, Daniel almost smiled. The sight was so typical, so normal. But then Richard spoke, voice flat, eyes never leaving the papers. "Daniel, sit." Something in that tone, the absence of warmth, the mechanical edge, sent a chill crawling up Daniel's spine. He sat anyway, the leather chair cold against his back. Richard finally lifted his gaze. Not a flicker of guilt, not even a pretense of camaraderie. Just a businessman about to cross something off his to-do list. "We're letting you go." The words were so casual, so brutally efficient, that Daniel thought he'd misheard. He blinked, waiting for the punchline, for context, for anything. "What?" His voice cracked, fragile. Richard leaned back, folding his hands across his chest. "It's not working out. We've decided to move in a different direction." No explanation, no warning, just that polished, dismissive tone. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Memories surged. Years of midnight emails, of canceled holidays, of patching Richard's failures and calling them victories. He had given this man everything, and in return, this. "You can't be serious," Daniel said, his voice sharper now, though it trembled at the edges. "After everything I've done, after everything I've carried for this company, this is how you treat me?" Richard's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Daniel, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You'll get a severance package. HR will sort out the details." Severance. The word tasted like ash, a final insult wrapped in corporate courtesy. Daniel's hands curled into fists on his lap, nails digging crescents into his palms. He wanted to scream, to drag Richard out of his chair and force him to see the wreckage of what he'd just done. But his body betrayed him. He sat frozen, suffocating under the weight of disbelief. Richard glanced at his watch, as if even this moment wasn't worth his time. "I'll need you to clear out your desk today." Today. Like he was already gone. Like he had never existed. Daniel rose slowly, every movement heavy like wading through wet cement. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. The words he wanted, rage, grief, accusation, died in his throat. Richard had already turned back to his reports. To him, the conversation was over. The walk back to his desk felt like a death march. Colleagues avoided his eyes, suddenly absorbed in screens, in staplers, in nothing at all. Someone whispered his name. Another stifled a nervous laugh. Daniel felt heat crawl up his neck, humiliation burning deeper than anger. At his desk, a cardboard box waited. Someone from HR had already placed it there, as if they'd been preparing for this moment long before he had. He stared at it, that stupid box, as if it were a coffin. He began placing his life into it. Photos, coffee mugs, sticky notes covered in scribbles of brilliance that had saved million-dollar deals. Each item was a memory, a sacrifice, a piece of himself. His hands shook as he packed. "Hey, man." A younger colleague, Matt, hovered nearby. His eyes darted nervously toward Richard's office. I'm sorry." Daniel forced a tight smile that felt more like a grimace. "Don't be. Just don't end up like me." Matt nodded, retreating quickly, afraid of guilt by association. By the time Daniel reached the elevator, the whispers were louder. The weight of the box bent his arms, But the heavier burden was the silence. The silence of people who had once come to him for help, who now pretended he was invisible. The elevator doors closed. For the first time in 8 years, Daniel was no longer part of the machine he had built. He was disposable, a replaceable cog tossed into the trash. As the elevator descended, the walls seemed to close in, pressing against him, squeezing the breath from his chest. His reflection stared back in the mirrored surface. Hollow eyes, clenched jaw, a man stripped bare of purpose. When the doors opened to the lobby, the receptionist looked up, her mouth half open as if she wanted to say something. But she didn't. She just lowered her gaze. Daniel walked out into the cold morning air, the city buzzing around him, alive and indifferent. The box dug into his ribs, each step echoing with a new truth. Loyalty had meant nothing. Trust had been a trap. And the man he had bled for hadn't. It even looked him in the eye when he cut the cord. Daniel stood there on the sidewalk, staring up at the glass building that had consumed nearly a decade of his life. His reflection shimmered faintly in the windows, small, distorted, forgotten. Something inside him cracked then, sharp and final. The fracture wasn't just in his career. It was in his very sense of self. And fractures once made don't heal clean. They splinter, they spread. This was the wound that would fester. This was the betrayal that would ignite the fire. The first week after the firing was a blur. Daniel slept late, not because he wanted to, but because waking meant remembering. The silence of his apartment pressed against him like a weight. No early morning emails, no buzzing phone, no one depending on him. The absence was deafening. He sat at his kitchen table, the cardboard box from the office still half unpacked, its contents scattered like relics of a former life. His coffee grew cold as he stared at job boards on his laptop. The words blurred. Qualifications, requirements, experience. He had all of it. More than enough. But every application he submitted vanished into silence. No callbacks, no interviews, nothing. Days turned into weeks. The rejection, or worse, the indifference, began gnawing at him. He was a man who had once kept an entire company alive, and now he couldn't even get a recruiter to return an email. The city kept moving outside his window, indifferent, the neon signs flashing, the traffic rushing, people with jobs, people with purpose. Bills piled up on the counter, rent, utilities, credit cards he'd leaned on too heavily in those first desperate weeks. He stared at the red notices, heart pounding, a sour taste in his mouth. His savings were draining faster than he wanted to admit. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment in Richard's office. The words, "We're letting you go," echoed, followed by the way Richard hadn't even looked at him. It wasn't just a firing, it was an erasure. Richard had erased him, reduced him to nothing in seconds. One night, after hours of restless turning, Daniel sat up, sweating. His mind looped the same poisonous thought. Maybe she was right. His ex, standing in the doorway years ago, eyes wet with frustration, telling him, "One day, you were going to realize you gave everything to a man who wouldn't blink before replacing you." He had laughed then. Now it felt like prophecy carved into his bones. The spiral deepened. He stopped answering texts. Friends invited him for drinks, for distractions, but he couldn't face their pity. He withdrew, swallowed whole by a sense of humiliation so sharp it felt physical. Then, one rainy afternoon, the phone rang. He almost didn't answer. The screen flashed a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he picked up. "Daniel?" A man's voice, familiar, but distant. "It's Harris. You remember me?" Daniel blinked. Harris had been a mid-level manager for one of their old clients. A logistics firm Daniel had practically rescued from collapse 2 years earlier. "Yeah, of course," Daniel said, his voice rough from disuse. "It's been a while." "I heard what happened," Harris said quietly. "Word gets around. Listen, I'll cut to the chase. We're in trouble. Again. And we don't want to go through Richard, but we trust you. You saved our asses before. Think you could look at the numbers? Just consult. Freelance. We'll pay." For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. The room felt smaller, tighter. Someone trusted him. Someone still saw him as more than disposable. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice steadier. Yeah, I can do that. That night, for the first time in weeks, he felt purpose return. He spread papers across his table, scribbled notes, mapped out solutions. The rain hammered against the windows, but Daniel barely noticed. He was alive in the work again, focused, sharp, the way he had been at the company, except this time it was different. There was no Richard, no arrogance hanging over him, just the problem, the solution, and his ability to deliver. 3 weeks later, Harris called again. Daniel, I don't know how you did it, but you saved us. We're stable now. We owe you. Word spread. Slowly at first. A whispered recommendation here, a name dropped there. Then faster. Clients who had once sat across the table from Richard realized they'd have been dealing with the wrong man all along. Daniel wasn't just efficient. He listened. He cared. He delivered results without ego, without empty promises. The irony stung. Richard had fired the very man who was now quietly siphoning away his credibility. Daniel felt something shift inside him as he signed his first real consulting contract. Relief? Yes. Validation? Yes. But beneath it all, something darker flickered. A thought he tried to shove down, but it kept resurfacing. Richard threw me away. But what if that was his biggest mistake? The more work Daniel secured, the more the bitterness sharpened into fuel. Each invoice he sent was a reminder that he was not disposable. Each satisfied client was proof that Richard had underestimated him. But proof wasn't enough. Not yet. Because every success Daniel tasted only made the memory of that cardboard box heavier, the humiliation deeper. He didn't just want to rebuild. He wanted Richard to see what he had lost, to choke on it. Late at night, when the work was done, Daniel found himself staring at the window, the city lights bleeding into the dark. His reflection stared back at him, eyes shadowed, jaw clenched. This isn't just survival anymore, he whispered to himself. This is war. And with that, the fire was lit. The catalyst wasn't just survival. It was transformation. The first crack of lightning before the storm. Success came slowly at first, like raindrops gathering into puddles. One client turned into three into five. Within a year, Daniel had built a name for himself, whispered at conferences, scribbled in the margins of business cards. Call him. He delivers. He rented a small office, not the glossy high-rise space Richard had loved, but a quiet floor in a converted warehouse on the city's edge. Exposed brick walls, creaking pipes, second-hand furniture. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. Every morning when he turned the key in the door, Daniel felt a pulse of ownership he had never felt in all his years under Richard. He should have been happy, proud, but pride curdled into something else. Every win brought Richard back into focus, not as a mentor, not even as a memory, but as a ghost, haunting the edges of every deal. Daniel couldn't shake the image of Richard's smirk, the dismissive tone, the way he had brushed him aside without a glance. Clients who came to Daniel often spoke of Richard, though not directly. We left our old firm, they would say. We were tired of being overpromised and underdelivered. Daniel would nod politely, but inside, each complaint was another nail in Richard's coffin. Nights became longer, sleep thinned into scraps. He sat at his desk with empty coffee mugs surrounding him, spreadsheets glowing on dual monitors, the hum of the radiator filling the silence. His eyes burned, but he couldn't stop. There was no ceiling now, no boss to appease, just the limitless drive to build, to climb, to prove. Yet beneath the drive there was obsession. He began tracking Richard's company in the shadows, pulling financial reports, listening to whispers in the industry, piecing together the cracks in the facade. Richard had overextended, too many risky acquisitions, too much debt, too little leadership. The empire that had once felt untouchable was crumbling. Daniel kept files, stacks of reports, notes, contacts, all cataloged with meticulous care. To an outsider, it would look like research. To Daniel, it was scripture. He studied Richard the way generals study enemies before war. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd catch himself smiling. A thin, sharp smile he didn't recognize in the reflection of his darkened window. It unnerved him, how much satisfaction he found in watching Richard stumble. But he couldn't stop. The transformation wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet, like a room filling with smoke. He stopped calling friends, stopped dating. Meals became an afterthought. His life narrowed into a tunnel with one exit: Richard's downfall. One evening, Harris, the client who had first given him a chance, invited him to dinner. A small gesture of gratitude. Daniel sat across the table, the glow of candles flickering across Harris's face. "You've built something impressive," Harris said. "But I have to ask, what's driving you? This isn't just business, is it?" Daniel hesitated. He wanted to lie, to brush it off as ambition. But the truth slipped out, low and sharp. "He fired me like I was nothing. I'll never forgive that. And I won't stop until he sees what that mistake cost him." Harris studied him for a long moment. Fork paused mid-air. Finally, he set it down. "Careful, Daniel. Revenge is fuel, sure, but it burns hot. Burns everything." Daniel forced a smile, but the warning lodged in his chest like a splinter. He told himself he was in control. But as he walked home that night, the city lights blurring in the rain, a voice inside whispered otherwise. Still, he couldn't turn back. Every client he won, every contract he signed, felt like a strike against Richard. And slowly, the scales began to tip. Rumors spread in the industry. Richard's company was faltering. Staff were leaving in waves. Investors were pulling out. Daniel drank in those whispers like wine. One night, hunched over his desk, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids, Daniel scribbled a phrase on a sticky note and slapped it on his monitor. Not survival, retribution. That became his mantra. His transformation was complete. No longer the loyal employee, no longer the discarded man clutching a cardboard box. He was something else now, sharper, harder, forged in betrayal and fire. And though he wouldn't admit it out loud, he felt alive in a way he never had before. Preparation didn't look like revenge. Not at first. On the surface, Daniel's life seemed like any other entrepreneur's. Early mornings, late nights, endless coffee, and a desk scattered with contracts. But beneath that surface, every move had a second purpose. Every success, every contact, every quiet conversation in a hotel lobby was part of a larger design. He became a student of Richard's downfall. Financial reports told one story: bloated debt, failed expansions, assets stretched too thin. But whispers told another. Former employees leaking frustrations over beers, clients confessing their distrust, investors quietly testing new waters. Daniel collected it all, like a patient archivist. He filled notebooks, color-coded files, and a private hard drive locked with 3 layers of encryption. In neat handwriting, he tracked Richard's missteps: bad contracts, soured partnerships, rumors of lawsuits. It was more than obsession, it was architecture. The foundation of revenge was being laid brick by brick. He didn't act hastily. That was the key. Impulse had no place here. Richard had discarded him with the efficiency of a man tossing out old furniture. If Daniel wanted justice, it couldn't be petty or rushed. It had to be total. A collapse so public, so undeniable, that Richard would choke on it. So Daniel waited. He built his consulting firm not only as a business, but as a counterweight. For every client Richard lost, Daniel positioned himself as the natural replacement. He didn't gloat. He didn't advertise. He let his results speak for themselves. By the time people realized they had shifted allegiance, the damage was already done. At conferences, Daniel played the long game. He wore modest suits, shook hands firmly, and never bragged. When asked about Richard's company, he would smile faintly and say, "They have their strengths, but I focus on what works." The restraint was calculated. He knew silence, when carefully placed, was louder than slander. Meanwhile, he forged alliances in unlikely places. A junior analyst at a rival firm, eager to impress. A disillusioned manager still working under Richard, willing to share tidbits for the price of a sympathetic ear. Each connection fed him more information, more leverage. By the second year, Daniel's network wasn't just clients. It was spies, allies, and bridges waiting to burn at the right moment. At night, when the office was quiet and the city's heartbeat dulled, Daniel would spread the files across his desk like a general reviewing maps. He traced the fragile veins of Richard's empire, the pressure points where one well-placed strike could cause collapse. Sometimes he would pause, staring at the wall, questioning himself. Am I building a business or a weapon. But the question always dissolved under the memory of that box in his arms, the whispers of colleagues, the cold dismissal in Richard's eyes. This wasn't just business. It never would be again. One evening, Harris visited his office. They shared a bottle of scotch, the amber liquid glowing in the dim light. "You've come a long way," Harris said, leaning back in his chair. "But I see it in your eyes, Daniel. You're not just chasing success, you're hunting him." Daniel didn't deny it. He swirled the glass, watching the liquid catch the light. "He took everything from me, made me believe I was nothing. I won't rest until he feels it too." Harris sighed, shaking his head. "Just remember, the longer the hunt, the greater the cost." Daniel set the glass down with a soft thud. "Then I'll pay it." The preparation extended beyond paperwork and whispers. Daniel began building capital, saving relentlessly. He took fewer luxuries, lived modestly, and reinvested every dollar back into his growing firm. He wasn't just preparing to compete, he was preparing to own. And then, one day, the opportunity revealed itself. A contact slipped him news over a quiet lunch. Richard E.'s company was bleeding faster than anyone realized. Investors were circling, not to save, but to scavenge. Rumors of a sale began to surface. A desperate move from a man who once bragged about building an untouchable empire. Daniel listened, his fork frozen midway to his mouth. A sale. The words pulsed like electricity through his veins. He leaned back in his chair, hiding the storm behind a calm nod. "Interesting," he said. That night, alone in his office, Daniel stood at the window, city lights flickering like embers below. He pressed his hand against the glass, his reflection staring back. Older now, sharper, eyes hardened by years of sleepless nights. The plan was no longer theoretical. The groundwork had been laid. Richard's empire was tottering, and Daniel had the resources, the network, the patience to be there when it fell. The preparation was over. The stage was set. All that remained was the first move. For years, Daniel had lived in the shadows of Richard's empire, gathering intelligence, building strength, waiting. But when the news of the possible sale reached him, it was as if the universe itself whispered, "Now." The first move couldn't be reckless. Richard was weakened, yes, but not defeated. A cornered predator still had claws. If Daniel lunged too soon, Richard would smell the blood in the water and double down. No, this first strike had to look like coincidence, like business as usual. So Daniel chose silence as his weapon. He began by tightening his relationships with Richard's wavering clients. Not by bad-mouthing, never that. Instead, he listened. When they vented frustrations about delays or rising costs, Daniel would lean in, nod, and offer quiet solutions. A revised contract here, a flexible payment plan there. Small gestures, but gestures Richard never offered. The results were invisible at first. A trickle of contracts shifting in Daniel's favor, signed without fanfare. But Daniel felt it, the slow unraveling. Clients weren't leaving Richard in anger, they were leaving with a shrug. Indifference was deadlier than rage. Rage kept you relevant. Indifference erased you. Then came the conference in Chicago, a gathering of industry giants, investors, and analysts. Richard would be there, of course. He thrived on visibility. Daniel attended, dressed in a dark, tailored suit that projected quiet confidence. No flashy tie, no ostentatious watch, just presence. The conference hall buzzed with energy, but Daniel noticed the subtle change. Once Richard had been the center of every circle, laughter erupting around him like fireworks. Now he still held a crowd, but smaller. Thinner smiles, distracted glances toward other conversations. Daniel didn't need to confront him. Instead, he moved through the hall like smoke, slipping into conversations, sharing insights, offering measured predictions about market trends. Each word was deliberate, each smile calibrated. At the evening reception, he found himself face to face with two of Richard's longtime investors. They were cordial but weary, their champagne glasses half empty, their expressions lined with quiet disappointment. "Richard still has vision," one said, more out of obligation than belief. Daniel offered a soft smile. "Vision is only as strong as execution." The words hung there, subtle, not accusatory. but he saw the flicker in their eyes. Seeds planted. That night, Richard spotted him across the room. Their eyes locked for the first time in years. Richard's expression faltered, just for a second, before curving into a practiced smirk. He raised his glass in mock salute. Daniel returned the gesture with the faintest nod, then turned away before the moment could linger. That, too, was a move. To acknowledge but not engage. To let Richard stew in questions. Why is he here? Why is he thriving? The next strike was quieter but sharper. Through his network, Daniel learned of a mid-sized client, one Richard had neglected, dismissing them as too small to matter. Daniel approached them directly, offering a customized plan that doubled their efficiency while cutting costs. The client signed within weeks, transferring a lucrative multi-year contract away from Richard's company. On paper, it was a minor loss. But Richard's empire was already brittle. Each missing piece weakened the structure. Weeks later, Daniel orchestrated another move, this one calculated to rattle Richard personally. He acquired a small warehouse property on the outskirts of the city. Nothing remarkable, except for its location, directly adjacent to one of Richard's key distribution centers. The purchase was made through a shell company, discreet, untraceable to Daniel. But when word inevitably reached Richard's ears, he would wonder. Coincidence? Or encroachment? The beauty of the move was its ambiguity. Daniel wasn't attacking, he was existing, occupying space. But in Richard's paranoid mind, it would feel like the first crack of thunder before a storm. One evening, Daniel received a call from Harris. "You've started," Harris said, voice heavy with both admiration and concern. Daniel sat at his desk, files spread before him like battlefield maps. "I've nudged the first domino." "And how does it feel?" Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Like control. For the first time in years, I'm not surviving. I'm directing." Harris was silent for a moment. "Just remember, control is an illusion. Don't mistake momentum for invincibility." But Daniel already knew the truth. The game had shifted. Richard no longer towered over him. They were now players on the same board, and Daniel had prepared far longer. The true power of the first move wasn't the damage it caused, it was the fear it planted. Richard began to notice. Clients canceling without explanation. Investors less responsive to his calls. Subtle whispers at industry events. He felt the ground shifting but couldn't pinpoint the cause. And at night, perhaps, he remembered Daniel's nod across that conference hall. The hunter was no longer hiding. The first move was complete. The game was in motion. Richard had always believed his empire was unshakable. For years, it had stood like a fortress. Clients loyal, investors dazzled, employees eager to cling to his rising star. But empires rarely fall with a single strike. They rot from the inside, quietly, until the walls collapse under their own weight. The weakening began not with an explosion, but a whisper. One morning, Richard sat in his corner office overlooking the skyline. His assistant placed a thin folder on his desk. Inside was a termination notice from a long-standing client, small but steady, a contract that had been with him for over a decade. Richard skimmed the letter twice, jaw tightening. The reason was vague. Exploring other opportunities. He dismissed it with a grunt. "Their loss," he muttered, tossing the letter aside. But the next week, another letter arrived, and then another. Clients weren't raging, they weren't slamming doors. They were leaving quietly, politely. The absence stung more than any confrontation. At board meetings, the energy had shifted. Once, his words carried weight. Every prediction, every boast met with nods of approval. Now the room felt colder. Investors leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, eyes skeptical. When he presented bold projections, silence followed, where applause used to erupt. Richard's temper grew short. He snapped at employees, barked at junior managers, demanded late-night reports that no one could deliver fast enough. His people were no longer inspired. They were afraid. And fear didn't build loyalty. It bred desertion. At an industry dinner, Richard noticed the change most sharply. He entered the room expecting the usual swarm of greetings. Instead, conversations paused only briefly before resuming without him. People shook his hand, smiled, then drifted away. He was still acknowledged, but not embraced. Across the room, he caught a glimpse of Daniel, calm, composed, surrounded by a small group of attentive listeners. Their laughter was genuine, their focus locked on him. Richard's chest tightened. For years, he had dismissed Daniel as irrelevant, a shadow from the past. Now that shadow had form, voice, influence. Richard forced a smile, joining a nearby conversation, but the laughter sounded distant, brittle. Every now and then, he found his eyes drawn back to Daniel. What is he doing here? Why does he belong? Behind the scenes, Daniel's quiet maneuvers continued to press against Richard's foundation. More contracts shifted. Investors redirected funds. Even suppliers began offering Daniel better terms, sensing the tides changing. Richard responded the only way he knew how: aggression. He launched new marketing campaigns, cut prices to undercut competitors, and promised grand expansions. But every move felt desperate, reactive. The market could smell desperation like blood in the water. His personal life, too, began to fracture. The late nights, the constant stress, the snapping temper. Friends drifted. Calls went unanswered. His once lavish gatherings shrank in size, the laughter hollow. Even at home, the silence pressed in. He drank more, slept less, his reflection in the mirror growing heavier, his eyes more bloodshot. One evening, he stormed into his office after a disastrous call with investors. His assistant, pale and nervous, informed him that another mid-sized client had transferred their contract to a competitor. "Which competitor?" Richard barked. The assistant hesitated. "Mr. Reed's firm." For a moment, Richard froze. The words echoed like a bell tolling doom. "Daniel Reed." "Are you sure?" he demanded. "Yes, sir." Richard slammed his fist on the desk, papers scattering. "That bastard," he hissed. But deep down, fear gnawed at him. Daniel wasn't just surviving. He was winning. And worse, he was doing it quietly, without spectacle. Every move was a phantom strike. Weeks turned into months and the cracks widened. Revenue dipped, staff turnover rose, investors whispered about pulling out. Richard's empire still stood, but its once shining walls were marred with fractures. The final straw came at the annual shareholders' meeting. Richard walked onto the stage, rehearsed smile plastered across his face, ready to deliver his usual show of confidence. The lights were bright, the applause polite, but thin. As he spoke, he felt the room slipping away. Eyes glazed over, hands typed quietly on phones. And then a question from an investor cut through the haze. "Mr. Grant, how do you explain the recent losses and the growing shift of clients toward your competitors, particularly Mr. Reed's firm?" The name rang through the hall like thunder. Daniel's name, spoken openly, without hesitation, in front of hundreds. Richard stammered, deflecting, trying to spin the narrative. But the damage was done. His audience had seen his weakness. They had smelled his fear. That night, alone in his penthouse, Richard poured himself another drink and stared out at the city. The skyline that once felt like his kingdom now looked foreign, hostile. Somewhere out there, Daniel was moving, pulling strings, dismantling everything brick by brick. Richard had built his empire on arrogance, intimidation, and spectacle. But Daniel's strategy was different. He wasn't storming the gates. He was loosening the hinges, and Richard could feel the fortress starting to sway. The weakening had begun. Richard had never been a man who tolerated ghosts. When something haunted him, he dragged it into the light, tore it apart, and reminded the world that he was still king. But this ghost, Daniel Reed, had become flesh, moving through the corridors of power that Richard once thought belonged solely to him. The confrontation was inevitable. It happened not in a boardroom or courtroom, but at a gala, an industry celebration where the city's elite gathered under chandeliers, sipping champagne and trading smiles laced with ambition. Richard had almost skipped it. His empire was bleeding, and he hated the idea of parading himself in front of the very people who now doubted him, but his pride wouldn't let him stay away. He had to be seen, had to remind them he was still a force. He arrived in his usual fashion, sharp suit, commanding stride, an aura of money and power. But unlike years before, the crowd didn't part for him. They acknowledged him with polite nods, then turned back to their conversations. And then he saw him. Daniel stood across the room, calm as ever, engaged in quiet conversation with two investors Richard recognized immediately, men who once swore loyalty to him. They were laughing, leaning in, hanging on Daniel's every word. Something inside Richard snapped. He strode across the room, jaw tight, eyes fixed on his former protege. The crowd sensed the shift. Conversations paused, heads turned, whispers rippled. By the time Richard stopped in front of Daniel, the air was electric. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice low but sharp. "Enjoying yourself?" Daniel turned, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. His face was unreadable, calm, collected, even kind. "Richard," he said evenly, "it's been a long time." The neutrality of the greeting only enraged Richard further. "Cut the act," he spat. "You think I don't see what you're doing? Stealing my clients, undermining my deals, whispering in ears that should never have been yours to touch." Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. "I don't steal, Richard. People choose where they want to place their trust. If some of your clients have chosen differently, perhaps the question isn't what I've done, but what you haven't." The words hit like daggers cloaked in silk. Around them, the room grew quieter. People pretended not to listen, but every ear was tuned. Richard's face flushed. "You ungrateful little—" He stopped himself, catching the watching eyes. He forced a smile that looked more like a snarl. "You think you can outplay me? I built this city's respect brick by brick. You're nothing but a shadow walking behind me." Daniel met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Shadows only exist when something blocks the light, Richard. Maybe people are realizing you've been standing in their sun." The metaphor landed like a slap. Richard's hands trembled slightly, and he clenched them into fists to hide it. His empire was crumbling, and here was the man he had discarded, once insignificant, now standing tall, unafraid. Richard leaned closer, voice dropping to a hiss. "I gave you everything, don't you dare forget that." Daniel's reply was calm, almost gentle. "You gave me lessons, Richard, but not the kind you think. You taught me how power built on arrogance collapses. You taught me how people stay until they realize fear isn't loyalty. And you taught me that the only revenge worth having is living better without you." Richard's jaw worked, but no words came. Daniel's composure was worse than rage. It was untouchable, a mirror reflecting Richard's downfall. The silence stretched, the weight of eyes pressing down. Richard straightened, forcing his chest out. "This isn't over," he snapped, the old bravado cracking at the edges. "I'll bury you before you ever stand where I've stood." Daniel didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, his voice calm. "Then try. But remember, sometimes the harder you dig a grave for others, the faster you fall into it yourself." With that, he turned back to the investors, dismissing Richard without a second glance. It was the ultimate insult. Not rage, not confrontation, but indifference. Richard stood frozen, humiliation burning through him. He wanted to roar, to reclaim the room, to demand attention, but the moment was gone. The crowd had shifted, drawn to Daniel's calm gravity. Richard was no longer the center. He was the spectacle, the man unraveling in real time. That night, alone in his penthouse, Richard replayed the moment over and over. Daniel's words cut deeper than any business loss. For the first time, Richard realized the truth. Daniel wasn't chasing him. He wasn't clawing at his empire. He was simply standing firm, and the world was choosing to follow. Richard slammed his glass onto the table, liquor spilling. His empire wasn't just weakening. It was slipping into the hands of the very man he had tried to destroy. And there was nothing more terrifying than realizing the battle had already shifted from power to legacy. The confrontation had ended, but the war had only just begun. By the time the final domino began to topple, the cracks in Richard's empire were no longer subtle. They were gaping. Revenue reports, once carefully massaged to hide the truth, now screamed of loss. Investors were frantic, murmuring to each other in hushed, anxious tones. Staff who had stayed loyal out of fear were gone, replaced by temp workers scrambling to hold together frayed projects. Daniel watched from the sidelines, unseen, a calm eye in the storm. His firm had grown strong, but he never interfered directly. He didn't need to. Richard's weaknesses, exposed and unaddressed, were doing the work. The subtle nudges, the stolen contracts, the whispers in the right ears, had all led here. The first public sign of the fall came in a press release. A mid-sized client that Richard had relied on for years announced a shift to Daniel's firm, citing trust and consistent results. The industry took notice, speculating on Richard's instability. Headlines began to appear. Former Titan struggles to retain clients, or Richard Grant, Empire faces investor exodus. It wasn't just the media, his own people were abandoning him. Middle managers who had once feared his wrath now quietly resigned, whispering their frustrations in exit interviews. "The culture's toxic," one said. "He's gone blind with arrogance. No one can fix it." Richard tried to fight back. He slashed prices, promised bonuses, launched aggressive marketing campaigns. But each attempt was reactive, desperate. Every move felt like chasing shadows. The more he pushed, the more clients defected, the more investors balked. One by one, long-standing contracts dissolved, legal disputes emerged over mismanaged projects, and suppliers began favoring Daniel's firm, citing reliability and prompt payment. Richard was no longer the predator, he was the prey. The apex came at a high-profile industry gala, intended as a celebration of Richard's company. He stepped onto the stage expecting applause. Instead, he faced polite claps, skeptical glances, and the inevitable whispers. Daniel entered the room late, calm, composed, commanding attention without even trying. Investors flocked to him naturally. The message was clear. The world had shifted allegiance. By the end of the evening, Richard's empire was effectively finished. Deals fell apart, partners refused to meet, and the board pushed him toward desperate measures: sell, liquidate, or declare bankruptcy. The man who had once ruled the room with ego and charisma now staggered under the weight of his own mismanagement and Daniel's quiet, relentless strategy. Daniel didn't gloat publicly. He didn't raise his voice or mock. His victory was not a display. It was inevitability. Every ripple he had set in motion now culminated in a tidal wave that swept Richard away. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's takeover was formalized. The acquisition of Richard's company completed smoothly, negotiated professionally, and with minimal fanfare. But for Richard, the humiliation was total. The employee he had fired and dismissed without thought was now the man signing the papers, the one deciding the future of the business Richard had once controlled. The ripple effects extended beyond business. Former employees felt vindicated, relieved even, to work in an environment where competence, not ego, dictated success. Investors who had lost faith in Richard found security in Daniel's leadership. The industry watched as a long-standing titan crumbled quietly, replaced by a figure whose calm efficiency spoke louder than Richard's bluster ever had. And Daniel? He felt a strange combination of triumph and emptiness. The satisfaction of victory was tempered by the realization of what he had sacrificed. Years of obsession, sleepless nights, the quiet alienation from friends and personal life. Success had come, but not without cost. Still, he allowed himself a private moment of vindication. Sitting in the newly acquired office, looking over the familiar walls that had once belonged to his former tormentor, Daniel allowed a small, quiet smile, not of arrogance, but of peace. He had taken what was unfairly taken from him, not with brute force, but with patience, intelligence, and resolve. Richard was gone from the office, gone from control, reduced to a cautionary tale whispered about at conferences and networking events. Daniel had emerged from the shadows not as a vengeful figure, but as a force of inevitability, proof that skill, integrity, and perseverance could outshine arrogance and entitlement. The fall was complete. The empire had shifted, the predator dethroned, and the student had become the master. Victory is never clean, is never. Daniel sat alone in the late-night quiet of his new office, the city skyline stretching out like a carpet of lights below. The acquisition papers lay neatly on the desk, signed and sealed. Legally, professionally, morally, he had won. Yet a strange emptiness lingered in the corners of the room, as if the walls themselves knew the cost of his conquest. He had spent years preparing, waiting, sacrificing. Nights blurred into mornings of endless coffee, spreadsheets, and whispered intelligence. Friends had drifted away, unable, or unwilling, to witness the obsession consume him. Relationships had suffered, personal life set aside in favor of meticulous planning. He had traded human warmth for the cold clarity of strategy. Even the victory, so carefully orchestrated, carried a hollow echo. Watching Richard's empire crumble, seeing the man he once respected reduced to humiliation, stirred not triumph but a complex, gnawing unease. The anger that had fueled him had done its work, yes, but it had also reshaped him. He had become someone he barely recognized. Patience sharpened into obsession, empathy dulled by calculation, mornings consumed by spreadsheets rather than laughter. The reflection in the glass across the room was Daniel Reed, the same man in name only, tempered and refined by fire, but also hardened, lonely, and irrevocably changed. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the city lights, recalling the moment Richard had first fired him. That humiliation had sparked the fire. That cold, dismissive moment had ignited a determination that could not be quelled. And now, having achieved his goal, he wondered what came next. There was a strange paradox in revenge. The target may fall, but the shadow of obsession lingers. Daniel realized he could never return to the ordinary world he had once inhabited. That life of simple routines, of quiet evenings with friends or family, now felt alien, impossible. His victory had elevated him, but it had also estranged him, from the world, from the people who might have been close, from himself. A soft ping of a notification pulled him from thought. Another client confirming a deal. Another contract executed flawlessly. The work continued. There was satisfaction in the tangible, in the results. But the thrill was different now. The fire that once roared from betrayal had cooled into a steady, controlled burn. He thought of Richard, not with hatred, not with schadenfreude, but as a marker of what he had overcome. The man's downfall had been inevitable, shaped by arrogance and neglect, accelerated by Daniel's own meticulous strategy, but observing it, Daniel felt a nuanced mixture. Triumph intertwined with sorrow, justice tempered by loss. He rose from his chair, walking slowly to the window. The city was alive, indifferent, humming with its constant motion. In that hum, Daniel felt both power and isolation. He had rebuilt the empire he once served, yet the quiet truth remained. Revenge had its price. No one witnessed the late nights alone, the decisions made in solitude, the subtle compromises of morality that had crept in like shadows. He had been forced to suppress tenderness, abandon patience, and embrace a single-minded obsession. It had won him the world, but it had also stripped pieces of his soul. Yet even in the quiet, there was clarity. He had proven something undeniable. Integrity, intelligence, and perseverance could outshine arrogance and entitlement. He had reclaimed his agency, rebuilt his life on his own terms, and exposed the truth that those who dismiss loyalty and effort may ultimately be swept aside. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the weight of silence settle. He wasn't joyful, not entirely, but he was steady, strong. Whole in a way the world now had to recognize, even if it came at a personal cost. For all the losses, the sacrifices, the lonely nights, he had survived, adapted, and prevailed. That was his reward, subtle but profound. And in that, he found a fragile, enduring sense of peace. Revenge had reshaped him, but it had not broken him. He turned back to his desk, eyes lingering on the skyline one last time before focusing on the tasks ahead. There was work to do, clients to serve, an empire to lead. Richard's shadow was gone, but the lessons, the fire, and the costs remained, and they would guide him in every decision yet to come. Victory, Daniel realized, was never just the fall of the enemy, it was also the reckoning with oneself, and he was ready.